This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 213 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we'll take a look at a reflection tool for students called Learning Stories. I think a lot of teachers would like to see their students be more reflective as learners, really thinking about their own growth over time, monitoring their progress, and setting personal goals for improvement. This is the kind of practice we see in lifelong learners, and it would be great to cultivate it in our students. But if you usually end up spending all your time and energy just making sure you teach your required course content, you probably find things like reflection often get left behind. What can help is to have a system that regularly sets aside time just for reflection, giving students a structure for looking back over their work and thinking about their growth. In this episode, we will look at a system just like that. It comes from my guest, Marcus Luther, a high school English teacher in the Pacific Northwest. You might remember Marcus from episode 186, when he shared a fantastic lesson idea for doing gallery walks with student poetry. Marcus has come up with a system for students to regularly reflect on their writing progress in a single document over the course of a school year, building each reflection on the one that came before it. Since implementing this system, he's seen student reflections become deeper and more complex, his students pay much closer attention to the feedback he gives them, and he's gotten a much clearer picture of what students are actually learning from his teaching. In his English class, he calls these documents the story of your year as a writer. Used in any subject area, they could simply be called learning stories. He's written a great blog post over on Cult of Pedagogy showing you how it works, and in this episode, we'll talk about it. Before we get started, I'd like to thank ListenWise for sponsoring this episode. ListenWise provides short, high-quality, age-appropriate podcasts for grades 2 through 12. Save time with pre-made lessons designed to build students' background knowledge and academic vocabulary. Keep students on grade level with scaffolding and differentiation. It's great practice for meeting listening and speaking standards. With ListenWise Premium, you get comprehension tools like quizzes, interactive transcripts, a text-to-speech toolbar with Spanish translations, graphic organizers, and more. It's perfect for English language learners. Learn more and sign up for free at cultofpedagogy.com/listenwise. Support also comes from Everfi. Want to prepare your students for career and life success, but short on time? Busy teachers use Everfi's standards-aligned, research-based digital lessons, recently awarded with the ISTE Seal for high-quality curriculum, to teach students to thrive in an ever-changing world. Interactive, game-based lessons designed by experienced educators help you engage students at all grade levels and bring critical, real-world skills like financial education, health and wellness, character education, early literacy, and more to your classroom. Thanks to partners, these lessons are free for all K-12 schools and students. With back-to-school season gearing up, now is an exciting time to give your students a jump start on their future. Go to cultofpedagogy.com/everfi, that's EVERFI, to learn more and sign up to get a virtual swag bag full of free goodies to get the school year off to a great start. Now here's my conversation with Marcus Luther about learning stories. All right, I am happy to welcome Marcus Luther back to the podcast for the second time. Welcome.
Thanks for having me again.
Sure. So you came to me a little while ago with this idea for something you're doing with your writing students that we wanted to share. And you and I agree that this probably could be used in a lot of other disciplinary areas. So we'll get into that too. So before you reveal what this new strategy is that you use, tell me what got you to the point of coming up with this and trying it. What was going on in your classroom?
Yeah, so at the end of every year, I try to sit back and reflect on what were the successes. I think that's important, but also where were their gaps, where were their walls? And we had really good data, including with writing. This is 2 years ago, or the 21-22 school year. But at the same time, I kind of thought to myself, I don't really know how students see themselves as writers. Like I see the numbers, I see the data, I feel good about that. That's important. But if a student would have asked, or if I would have asked a student, rather, how do you see yourself as a writer? I don't think I could have anticipated the answer. And I thought a lot about that, and also just about how, in general, I talk a lot about reflection being an important value. But if I'm saying it's an important value and we're not making time for it in the class, I don't necessarily think it's an important value. So I wanted to hold myself accountable to that and just build a system, because I knew reflection is the kind of thing that gets shoved out of the way. It's easy to say. We all know intrinsically it's important, but then so many other things jump in line, and then
Mm-hmm.
the reflection doesn't happen. So I was
Mm-hmm.
really thinking, how can I build a system that will make me value reflection in terms of the time we spend in the classroom? And then ultimately, we're all have an answer to that question. How do students see themselves as writers at the end of the school year?
Okay. And so what you did was you created this document called The Story of My Year as a Writer. And before we get into it, you and I have talked about how this could be applied in other areas. What I was thinking as I was reading, because you're writing a blog post to go with this, I know that in the sciences there seems to be a big shift in the last couple of years to getting kids to think like a scientist. So I could see it working in that, and also in social studies and history, thinking more like a historian. There's a lot of a trend sort of across a lot of platforms to thinking like a practitioner, because I think sometimes writing gets pigeonholed as well. Like that's a practicable skill. All the other areas are just content. But I do think there is a shift in those other content areas towards being a practitioner. So I could see how this could work in those. So tell me about this reflection document, my story as a writer.
For sure. I very much think it can be simplified if for other content just by focusing on what are your major assessments where you're giving feedback. And we'll talk more about what giving that feedback can look like as a classroom
Mm-hmm.
space. But that can just be like unit 1, unit 2, unit 3. So the example I provide is aligned with what we do in a particular course this past year in English with the AP literature course, but it could be used, I'm planning on using it with other courses this next year. It really can be adjusted. And it's, I guess at its bones, it's a pretty simple document in terms of you just line up, here are the assessments students will receive feedback on over the course of the year. Or if you wanted to, you could, I guess, divide it over semesters if that's easier to
Mm-hmm.
plan. And
Mm-hmm.
then just creating a column for students to reflect on their process and reflect on the feedback they get. So there's two separate spaces of reflection throughout the document. In a nutshell, that's the document. And I think it's
Right.
what we do with it that matters a lot.
Yeah.
I try to make sure it looks the way I want it to look. And there's examples in the blog post to check it out.
Mm-hmm.
But really, it comes down to a document that lays out assessments and then process and feedback that students can fill out ongoing throughout the year in a single document. And I think that's important.
Yeah. So because we're going to talk about sort of how you actually present this to students, but let's stick with this idea first of why did you choose to put it all in one single document?
For me, I feel like I've tried to push myself in recent years to make sure we're not just doing the same thing every essay, every writing assignment, trying to have
Mm-hmm.
versatility in what we ask of students in terms of how they show their learning, whether projects or different forms or genres of writing or even synthesizing different genres. And in individually, those can be really cool things. But
Mm-hmm.
then when you step back, it can feel really fragmented. And like when the student thinks about what they did over a year, it can feel scattered, and I
Mm-hmm.
wanted there to be some glue for them, but also for me. So this document is the glue of our course in a way, because they're always coming back to this document. They're literally hyperlinking their projects and their work to this document. So they're not just floating around Google Drive or random backpacks. Like, it's all in one space, and it's all in one space for me as a teacher, which is really helpful. Like 3 clicks away at any moment, I can access all of this. And I think that's a really valuable part of this format and why it works.
Right. So just logistically, this first time that you tried it this year, you just created a class set of this same document, shared it with students, and gave yourself access. And you had said that you give yourself all of the access, editing access and everything. Why not just commenting access?
So the access is really helpful on my end, and you could flip it where students created it and shared it with you. Part of
Right.
me doing it early on to keep control of it was really nice in terms of
Mm-hmm.
setting them all up and sharing them out at the start of the year when we have a little bit of flex time. But for me, we did activities, and we'll talk about some of those over the year with the document where I would add things to it. So in terms of like follow-ups,
Oh.
so and I didn't
Mhm.
want those activities to live on the document at the start. And a part of me was also this was a work in progress where
Yeah.
I didn't think at the start that it would become what it did in terms of the final project and the
Okay.
activities
Yeah.
we did with it. So it gave me the flexibility to adjust as the year went on. I don't think you
Got
have
it.
to have editing access necessarily to make it work. I found it helpful for me to keep the document evolving to meet the needs of our class.
Got it. So anybody that's maybe just getting started with this, that would be a good idea, just so that they have a little bit
Mhm.
more control over it. So I'm looking at this. I'm going to describe it for listeners. I'm looking at a blank document, and it says the story of my year as a writer, and then it explains the goal. And we're going to have a picture of this in the post. But then along the side for your class, you've got Unit 1 fiction focused essay, Unit 2 flash fiction piece, and so there's just a list of all the main pieces that they write. The center column, how do I feel about the process and what I invested into this piece? And then the final column, how do I feel about the results, including feedback, and what is my takeaway? So, how did you, for the first assignment, how did you sort of roll this out to students and get them to fill it out for the first time?
So I'll answer that in two parts because the first step was just this was one of our like first couple weeks of school, setting up a Google Drive folder, creating the document blank, and then saying, "Hey, we're going to come back to this." I just making
Okay.
sure it's all shared, it's all set up, making dotting the i's, crossing the t's.
Hmm.
And then when we went into our first feedback process, then we opened the document back up and
Hmm.
filled it out. And you actually mentioned in our talking before this, like something I'm planning for next year in terms of my own learning, is one, I'm going to create my own document and I'm going to reflect on my process and results as a teacher alongside them.
Mm.
So, and I'll
Hmm.
have that so that they can see that. So I'll be
Hmm.
transparent about that ongoing. So I'll, for instance, when they write their Unit 1 essay, all have my process reflection about how I did as a teacher in facilitating their work with that Unit 1 essay, and
Hmm.
then my reflections on their feedback or on the feedback that they got. So
Okay.
I'm going to try and do this with them next year is one of my goals. But then also, and I think a point that you made that I think is going to be really helpful is offering more scaffolds and models because last year it was new. This year it's
Yeah.
not. Now I've got a whole class set of these where I can pick some of the best reflections and show them for students as models to kind of push them towards, especially early on when they haven't
Mm.
done it before, to
Yeah.
push them towards high quality reflection, which is a skill, again, we talk a lot about. We don't do the work of helping students become better at reflecting as much as we can. And this is something that I think I want to prioritize even more going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to set aside the actual time for it, but then it's a different kind of writing. It's a different genre of writing, and so they've got to also sort of learn how to do that in a high quality way. So you've got everything set up, and then we've got this other section of the post that's called "What Reflection Days Look Like." So your students have done a writing assignment. You have read their turn-ins and graded them. One of the things you mentioned is that you sort of hide your feedback and grades from them. How do you do that in a shared Google Doc? Explain that to me.
So, and I'm guessing that other teachers have other systems that they'd have to come
Mhm.
up with their solutions. For me, and partly this gets into the world of me having access to their documents to know
Mm.
what they're doing in their process. So I
Mhm.
create, if they have a given formal writing assignment, I create all the documents, share them out to the students they write, and then I grade, when I grade them, I remove access. And then
So it starts as your document.
it starts
They
as my
have access
document.
to write it, and then you take that away while you're grading it and then give it
It,
back to them.
it takes some time on the front end. My
Yeah.
students frequently make fun of me for how A-type I am about Google Drive and Google Documents, but I found it really helpful. It started with I used to grade without taking access away, and then I'd
Mhm.
have like the random student would pop on while I was
Yes.
grading, and it was kind of weird. And that was an easy solution for me. But then for this, the value I found was if you were grading over a week's time, because it takes time to grade essays, as
Mhm.
any English teacher knows, and you're sharing the results back as you finish, the students are processing those on their own, whether they're like looking on their phone when they get the email,
Yeah.
maybe they're pulling up a computer while doing another homework assignment, and they're all doing it on their own time at a different time. And I
Yeah.
wanted the feedback to be more of a collective experience in terms of how they processed it, including with each other. And that's
Mhm.
why I release them back, usually like the period before my prep period that day. So they don't really have much of a window of time before they see their documents. Most of them are opening their documents for the very first time in that class period. And that's the goal.
Okay. I think all of that is really, really good. And it really ties in with, and I wish I could remember her name. She was on a different podcast and she shared a process that she used where she would have students look at their feedback first before they found out their grade or saw the rubric. She would show them the written stuff. Then they would see. And it's the same kind of idea of not revealing everything at once so that students actually can process more carefully. So I think those little tiny sort of tech-based touches can really make a huge difference. So what happens then you're ready to show students their grades? You do some stuff in class that day. Okay, I've got your essays graded, but you do, and this is my favorite part. You do some stuff first before they see what they got. Tell us about that.
Of course. So as I'm grading, I basically keep an extra document open,
Mm-hmm.
usually several extra documents. And one of
Mm-hmm.
those that I'm collecting is trends. And I'm looking for here are pieces of feedback that I find myself giving again and again and
Mm-hmm.
again, and really staying away from the grammar traps. I think a lot of times we think of feedback, it's all in conventions and grammar as English
Yeah.
teachers, but more thinking at a deeper thinking level and skill sets. What trends am I noticing? And I'm just taking notes, and sometimes copying some examples. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
also, and someone, I shared this with someone, and they said, well, are you doing this for positives too? And I was like, oh, I need to add that in. So starting in unit 2, I started doing it for both. Here are some things I really liked in terms
Yeah.
of trends, and then doing some trends, of course, for growth areas. So
Mm-hmm.
then when students get to class that day, we start off with a reflective exercise where I go over the trends before they've seen the feedback, and they write down the main trends I've seen across the class. And then
Mm-hmm.
as they're doing this, I'm having them do quick partner talks and group talks saying, how do you feel about that trend? Do you think it applied to yours? And they're processing these trends as a class before they've seen their feedback. And it really heightens the engagement for like they're
Mm-hmm.
ready to see their documents at this point because now
Mm-hmm.
they have a language of, oh, these are some potential growth areas and what I can be looking for and talking about, and they're just excited. Like
Yeah.
it becomes a community process. And the other thing is it opens the door to, oh, I can talk about what I did, my process, and also talk about my results potentially if I want to with the people around me. And so often
Yeah.
feedback becomes this very siloed experience, and I want it to be a community experience. And that's the goal
Yeah.
of this. And what I realized kind of before, watched it happen this year is that bringing these conversations into the classroom, especially on these reflection days, made this a community experience. I think that's really important because we just don't do that enough in life.
No, I'm thinking about what a contrast of this is when I used to just distribute graded assignments and everybody would be super quiet for a minute or two. They'd look at it and then they would put it away or recycle it or whatever, and that was it. So this is so much better. I'm
And
looking right.
selfishly, let me plug, like as a
Yeah.
teacher, that's the worst feeling. You do all this work, hours and hours of work,
Yes.
and then you can tell it's not being internalized the way you hoped it would be from
Right.
students. So it is fun to see a whole class where you're basically showing off, here's all the work I did to give feedback. You're being
Yeah.
really transparent about what you're
Hmm.
looking for so they get to see your process, which also
Hmm.
has value. But it feels good as a teacher if we spend so much time with good feedback on assessments. Build a class around it. It's worth
Yeah.
it. It feels good.
Yeah, and I, what you're saying, I'm thinking each kid doesn't really think about the fact that you graded theirs and everybody else is in this class period and others. And this document that I'm looking at right now, I'm looking at a Google slideshow that you created, which is the debrief of this first essay. You linked it to that, which is what you go over when you're going over the trends. And just for people listening to hear the kind of things that you talk about, one of the things the trend number one says failure to specifically explain evidence. And you say a lot of the essays would give a piece of evidence, like a long one, and then they would just jump right to the next thing without explaining its meaning. That's such a fine grained thing that happens. And for you, and then you give an example and then tell them what to improve on. And so instead of the students looking at their own work while you're giving this information, this really makes them absorb just what you're saying and thinking, do I do this? I don't know. And so I absolutely love this practice of giving trends to the whole class and having them think about it before they look at their own work. This is really
And
genius.
and with writing, at least, these trend documents or this slide deck becomes a great resource to provide students before their next writing assignment. So, hey, remember those trends last time you had an assignment? Why
Right.
don't you go back through them in your revision process before you submit your second or whatever consequent
Right.
essay is?
Right. So you do that. You go through the trends. They they look at it. They talk with each other between each one about whether or not they're the ones or they did the same that thing in their writing, and then they get their work returned to them.
Of
So
course, yeah, and that's a
yes.
silent space in the class where
Mhm.
they're reading through their feedback
Mhm.
and then we're saying, please open up your reflective writing story documents. So then
Mhm.
reflecting on their process, reflecting on their feedback, and filling out how they did in their own words and how they've internalized my feedback. And that's an important point. And that space is important too, because now you've got 15, 20 minutes of class where they're all silently looking through their feedback. And first thing I say is that I want to honor that silence. But if you have a question about anything I said, if you think I made a mistake, I'm
Mm.
walking around. And I think a lot of times in the past, I've said those things and then the bell rings. In this case, you're creating space and you get those hand raises and you have those conversations with
Yeah.
students. And you can even just go around and check in and say, hey, we're all good. And you get that look, especially later in
Right.
the year. You can tell if a student has a question. And it's a really important space to give them time to process their feedback in class because we
Right.
value it. So we got to make time for it in the classroom.
Yeah. So once again, this is a whole class period that this reflection day is. This
Yeah,
is
about
a
probably about 40 to 45 minutes. So if it's a block
okay.
schedule, we might do something else, but
Got it.
it's not
Good
something that
chunk.
you're doing for 5 minutes and moving on.
Yeah. And that sends a really important message because nobody wants to be that kid who's just like, oh, I'm going to make it, like, let's just move on. Let's move on to the next thing. So this is really giving that time and space so that they believe that you're there to talk about this with them longer. So they complete their writing story document for that assignment, and then you continue to do this throughout the year. I know that there is also an end piece that we're going to get to in a minute. Is there something that is supposed to be happening also as they add on more and more assignments? Do they go back and look at earlier things? What's going on as the year progresses?
So, for instance, in Unit 2, part of their process and feedback reflection, what they're asked to do in that day for the second essay would be go back and read your first process. And these are documents that they have access to all the time. So, if they ever
Mm-hmm.
want to go check their reflections on it, they have access to it. But I'm trying to make sure that they are not just moving forward, but making sure as they move forward, they pay attention to what was their process before and what was their feedback before. And we
Mm-hmm.
talk about, we stopped at semester and we had an activity around this. And what patterns are you seeing? Like if your process is the same every time and you're getting results that you don't want to have, because this wasn't all, oh, everything is great. There's some students who they even told me, they said, Mr. Luther, like I have a problem with this procrastinating thing and like I can see it on my document. And it's one thing to say I struggled with procrastination. It's another thing to see on a document that you've written that 3 times in a row in unique ways and the pattern is just jumps off the page. And I think
Mm.
it really is an accountability tool from a student's perspective too, because it's their words. It's something
Mm-hmm.
family conferences, pull it up the document
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, we might be getting to this later in the conversation, but
No, let's talk about it now. Yeah, you're saying
yeah,
it's a tool for those. Yeah.
so we've talked a lot about like student-led conferences is a really
Yeah.
important thing, but oftentimes I feel like when I've tried to do those in the past, it feels like last minute or the week of, hey, maybe a student fills out a reflective document about what they've learned. This is an organic document that's been building throughout the year, and it's digital. So parents walk in, families walk in, throw the document on the screen, read what the student wrote about their own learning, whether it's writing
Yeah.
or something else for another course, and then ask them, hey, tell me more about this. Let's talk about this. I can't think of a better way to start a conference, especially at the high school level with students taking ownership. Like I've just loved this tool, and this was not what I was anticipating when I created this, and then
Yeah.
realized, oh, this has been the best conference tool I've ever had as a teacher. So I'm excited to lean even more into it next year.
Yeah, yeah, I love that, and I love that it kind of like surprised you as an additional use for it. So we've also, before we sort of move on to like what you do near the end of the year, that you've got these other two questions. So if I'm in this class on reflection day, what do we do about kids who didn't complete the essay, and then also kids who are absent during the reflection day? How do you handle that?
Those are real concerns, and I think
Hmm.
there isn't a perfect answer to it. So I don't want to pretend that it's all, you know, everyone's holding hands and everything's great. Even like there's
Hmm.
going to be students, and maybe for valid reasons, maybe they were absent that full week. Maybe they just haven't completed the assignment, because usually these are bigger tasks, not just
Right.
shorter writings. So an easy answer is that, of course, they can go along with the trends and participate in that activity even without having
Hmm.
completed the assignment. And then during that individual space where other students are reading feedback, it's good work time for those students and conferencing time for you and those students to talk with
Got it.
them.
Got it.
And I have no doubt that if you're a student who hasn't completed the assignment, that day isn't a fun day to be in class. And this is
Yeah.
was with high school juniors and seniors, so I do think there's some accountability built into that. And
Hmm.
I also just overall see the value it added for the vast majority of students, and I don't want to take away that value because of one or two students in a class not having it done. But I
Hmm.
will own, like, that's something that I need to make sure I check in with those students and have a plan for them going into that type of class period, because you don't
Got
want it
it.
to feel like a too much of a negative space. For
Right.
students who are absent, the best thing about a digital world is all these tools are laid out digitally, so they can receive their feedback, they can go through the Google Slides of trends, and then I need to follow up with them to make sure
Mm.
not just that they completed the reflection, but that they felt like they understood the process.
Got
So
it.
because absences are a real thing, especially in our current landscape with chronic absenteeism skyrocketing, quite
Yeah.
honestly, like having a plan of what are you going to do for the students who aren't there, especially
Mm.
for experiences in the class that are so core to the classroom community.
Right.
And I think that's
Right.
something to hold yourself accountable to as well.
So we get to the end. Well, actually, we didn't get into the TQE part. When does that come in? Is that during the year or is that closer to the end?
I stopped at the end of the first semester to spend a full dedicated period with this document.
Hmm.
And we did some other reflective exercises towards the end, but this was one of the big ticket ones that I think is cool to talk about, partly because this TQE process I found on your website in terms
Hmm.
of, and Marissa Thompson, I've talked, she was generous to share it with me. It became a big part of our class this last year and will be going forward. Uh, and
That is
it,
episode
yeah, you talked
10.
through it.
That's episode 103, just for people listening, because I'm going to be able to link it on the website. But if you're listening, this is the Thoughts, Question, Epiphanies Method, TQE, Marissa Thompson, and it's spread like wildfire. So that's 103. Okay, so you use this method with your students with this document.
Yeah, so the students, we came in, they'd already received all their feedback. So this wasn't like a new feedback day. So they
Hmm.
came in, they pulled up their document, and they got dedicated time to go back through an entire semester's worth of reflections. I think they had 5 different assessments that were already on the document. And they actually had to use the same annotation TQE tool that we've been using for literary text throughout the
Hmm.
semester on their own reflective document. And they had to go say, what was something that really stood out to them, and they had to reflect why. What was a question they had about themselves, and what was an epiphany they had about
Hmm.
themselves, and then sharing with each other in small groups what were their TQEs for their own reflections. So this is students, when you think about it, stepping back, they had conversations with each other about their own journey as a writer and the
Yeah.
things that they had questions about and what they understood about themselves with each other. I wasn't involved. I was trying to give
Hmm.
them that space. The other thing, because I've become a pretty big fan of anytime you can ask students to give something a title and explain why.
Hmm.
And I asked them to give their first semester a title as Journey as a Writer and then explain why. And we did that one whole class because selfishly I wanted to hear these. And so the semester ended. This is a pretty cool way to end a semester as opposed to like collecting a Scantron. Every student in a classroom going around and saying, this is the story of my semester at that point
Mm.
as a writer, and here's why. We did the same activity at the end of the school year. And some of those titles were really cool. I had, let me see, Growth is Time, A Pebble in the Ocean, Riding Quickly, comma, Slowly, The
Hmm.
Rabbit Holes Are My Home, The Not So Goldilocks Rider. And so just like those, and then they explain and on the documents as
Yeah.
well. And going back to my original wall, like not knowing how students saw themselves as writers,
Hmm.
I think back to I was that kid like back in second grade who like I got glasses really early on, and like the story everyone tells of leaving the optometrist office and looking up and be like, oh, that's not just a tree. There are leaves on that tree.
Yes, I
And
remember that too.
I think a lot of us have that
Yes, I
experience.
can see grass. Yeah.
For me this year, what this document has been, and seeing how students see themselves as learners, my experience has been kind of the same thing. Oh, there are leaves on those trees. Like, I'm
Mm,
understanding something and have tangible understanding of it where I can access it at any point. How do my students see themselves as learners in a way I
mm,
haven't had before? And
yeah.
it makes me think about, like, well, how do I don't ever want to go back to the before time. Like this needs to be
Yeah.
core to what I want to do going forward. And that's the best way I can encapsulate why this matters so much to me, is because it gives me insight into how students see themselves as learners.
Hmm.
And that's the ball game. Like, we talk about data and charts, and regardless of what your pedagogy is on standardized tests, etc., I don't think we value enough students' self-perception of learning and their
Mm.
identity as learners. And this is a way to make that tangible in your classroom.
Yeah. I mean, what I've been thinking as you've been talking about this too is that it gives them an identity as learners. Like, and I'm pronouncing that with more emphasis on that just because I think a lot of students, if they're kind of disconnected and not really that engaged in school, they just see school as a place where you show up, you do what someone else tells you to do, and then you leave. And if you do enough of that, then you get a piece of paper and you get to move on in life. But I don't think enough students see themselves as active learners who are there because they want to learn and they've got tools and agency and all of that stuff. And I think this treats them all as writers, and I would think that sharing some of these experiences with each other would really validate that, oh, everybody struggles with A, B, and C, and that I'm not the only one. That's part of it. And so it just sounds like very rich conversations that are probably very satisfying. Do students report back to you that they liked it? Did they say that they enjoyed this process?
Yeah, I think this was just reading through some of their culminating reflections. It felt like they understood their journey and their growth
Mm,
as a writer. And
hmm.
for some students, they even admitted like they had seen themselves as, quote, like a good writer, and they didn't really know what that meant. And they kind of had to break that down and reconstruct that identity,
Yeah.
because at the same time, we were pushing a lot of different ways, like trying to go outside the box, and multi-genre writing and
Mm,
synthesis writing. We every writing experience was different in some way. And this being the glue that allowed them to then look back at the full story of the year and then to talk about it with others. I mean, separately, we had a separate reflective space, but one at the end of the year. But one of the things I realized, that actually our final class of the year, I had planned out that I was going to kind of get the closing 15 minutes or so to do like a, thanks, and, do some final thoughts, etc. Us teachers, we love pedestals and putting ourselves on them at times. Uh, and they were talking with each other about their final projects and doing
hmm.
individual shares and after peer affirmations. And they were going so long that we ran out of time. And I'm just sitting in the corner, and then they all looked at me. I'm like, "Yep, that's the bell. Like, have a good summer." And like, it became their class. It became their classroom,
Mm,
and that's what it should be.
mhm.
The way this is a way to decenter us while
Yeah.
also supporting them on their journey. And I think that's something that I want to keep pushing myself to do as much as possible.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. Did we miss anything? Did we get to? I feel like we've covered everything, but is there anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
1 second. Oh,
Sure.
no, I think the biggest thing is that the setup matters a lot.
Okay.
And I'm reflecting now about making sure that not having a good setup. I got a few students who were absent those early days, and then, oh,
Mm,
they didn't get their documents set up, and they became this ongoing thing. And I kept having to find, and fix that situation. So the more you can do on the front end to have it planned out, it'll make it easier. But
right.
ultimately, and the point I don't think I made yet, is that having this document and having all those blank squares was my accountability, because the students, like, I knew that we had to not only complete those assignments, and you can
Mm,
adjust, we adjust over the course of the year, but more importantly, we had to create space to fill out this document in the
right.
classroom. So if I would have gone into the school year and said, hey, reflection's important to me, maybe it would have happened. I hope it
Mm,
would have happened. But by creating a system that prioritized reflection, that was the accountability tool I needed to make time and space for it. And now after going through it, it's my motivation's there. But I think for a
Yeah.
lot of us, it's real. We have all these ideas and values we want to become real in our classrooms, but creating a system and time and space dedicated for that system, that's really important. And that's what I look back on this process, and the document itself was more than anything something to make me better at creating time for students to reflect more than
Mm,
anything.
yeah. One thing that this made me think of while you were talking is that the fact that you have them do this in class, I think, is really significant as opposed to just assigning it for homework. I'm hearing so many conversations about AI and Chat GPT and how do we ever get around this? And my first answer is always the same: like, have them write in class, right in front of me. Granted, they can open a tab, but still, having students do any kind of writing in the room with you is probably, I think, one of the best preventions of any kind of plagiarism or using some other tool to replace you as a writer.
Oh, I completely agree with that. And also, just at a bigger level, and this goes beyond questions that either of us can answer, the idea of what does it mean for you to be a writer in today's moment? And what does it mean to be
Mm,
a writer in a world where
mm,
you have artificial intelligence, et cetera, or really a learner overall? These reflections probably are more important than any other time, because we want to have these conversations with students about their process of learning as new tools and paradigm shifts, really, with what
mm,
we're seeing are coming our way as educators. The more we can build a rapport and relationships with students around their journey as learners, that gets away from the gotcha game and the catching cheating.
yeah,
Like, it's
yeah.
about your journey and your growth as a writer. And I'm not just saying that to pay lip service to it. Like, it's a real thing, tangible, and we're going to create time and space for that in our classroom. And because there were times, quite honestly, where students would write things on these documents, and I was completely surprised. They saw themselves differently than how I thought
Mm,
they saw themselves. And then I'd see trends. Oh, it's not just skills, it's mindsets that we got to work on as
yeah.
writers. And I think all of that matters even more right now with ChatGPT and with all these other things inundating us. Yes, doing it in class matters, but then also the idea of what is your identity as a learner in
Mm,
this current moment. That's the
mm-hmm,
ball game. And I really think we want to spend
mm.
as much time as possible having those conversations in our classrooms.
Yeah, yeah. This is also making me think about, I'm not sure if you listened to any of the stuff I did with Shane Saphir and Jamila Dugan on street data, but their whole approach to school change is built around listening to your to your stakeholders, particularly the ones who are more marginalized. And using practices like what you're describing is a way of gathering that input and that data from all of your students and having them participating more in their own learning and seeing them the way that they see themselves and understanding what they need and all of that, as opposed to just guessing like, how do I make my kids better writers? And it's like, well, maybe we can start by finding out how they see themselves as writers.
And this is data, right? And the same with what you're
Yeah.
saying. Like, I think a lot of times we put data into a small box of some spreadsheet, and that data matters, but this data
Mm,
matters a lot. And
it
like how
does.
students own reflections, written reflections, and I have a whole class set of almost 100 of these documents now of how students saw themselves as writers throughout my course. That's great data to reflect upon going into future years. So, and that data that honors authentically how students experienced what their learning was. So
Right.
I agree 100%.
Yeah, I think it's telling you how they are experiencing your class also, because if I do this with my students and they all see themselves as terrible writers, that should be telling me something about the way that I'm teaching class, you know? It's That's more data. So, if people wanted to give you a shout out online or ask you a question or learn more from you, what's the best place for them to look online?
I'm a very active now at this point member with kind of teachers on Twitter. Just having that community has been
Yeah.
the best PLC for me. I have a great PLC at our school, so I very much appreciate that. But I also have found so many resources and strategies online. And my handle for Twitter is Marcus Luther 6, and really just try to share and participate in conversations online, because we're all in this together. Teaching is community work, and
Mm,
I've from these conversations and different podcasts and resources you've shared have entered my classroom, and I try to just pay it forward by sharing things that are working for me. So,
Yeah.
and then I also keep a blog with a Substack. So that's thebrokencopier.substack.com. If you want other resources, though this one, of course, will be right here on your website. I'm really excited to share the system and the process with any folks who find it helpful.
To read Marcus's blog post and see examples of his students' learning stories, visit cultivepedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 213. To get a bi-monthly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultivepedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.